Hey guys, tonight we're drifting into one of my favorite slow burn corners of early American history. So go ahead and dim the lights, sink a little deeper into whatever you're lying on, and let your brain slip into that soft pre-sleep fog. No rush, no drama, just a cozy stroll through centuries of people making questionable life choices. Because tonight, we're talking about the birth of New York City. A place that's loud, dramatic, chaotic, but don't worry, none of that will show up here. We're going back to when New York was a sleepy, muddy outpost run by people who mostly annoyed each other and definitely annoyed everyone else, which is kind of perfect bedtime material. So let's settle in, take a slow breath, and float with me back to the early 1600s, long before the bagels, the skyscrapers, or the endless honking. Just a lonely island, a few confused Europeans, and a whole lot of, we have no idea what we're doing. We begin, as so many colonial disasters begin, with a European delegation who absolutely thought they knew best. In this case, it was the Dutch who decided they needed their own foothold in the New World, because apparently every kingdom in Europe had FOMO. The Dutch Republic was in its golden age, trading, banking, painting tiny portraits of solemn men with dramatic collars. You know, their version of living the dream. And they looked west, toward the lands they politely pretended weren't already occupied by thousands of indigenous people who had been thriving there for centuries. But we glide past that because this is a sleep story, and also because most Europeans at the time had the emotional awareness of a soft-boiled turnip. Let's float over to a ship creaking gently across the Atlantic, commanded by a man named Henry Hudson. Hudson was an Englishman hired by the Dutch, which already tells you he was having one of those "I will work for whoever actually signs the checks" kind of careers. His job? Find a shortcut to Asia. Not a small assignment, but Europeans loved assigning impossible tasks and then acting shocked when they didn't work out. Hudson didn't find Asia, of course, but he did stumble into a calm, wide river that the Dutch would eventually decide belonged to them. Hudson sailed up what would become the Hudson River. Yes, they named it after him because Europeans loved nothing more than casually renaming things that had perfectly good names already. As he drifted up the river, he took notes, met Lenape communities, and confidently wrote things like, "This will be very profitable." The man had never seen a real estate brochure, but spiritually, he was already a landlord. But Hudson himself doesn't stick around long. His crew eventually mutinies, because nothing says productive workplace culture than tossing your boss into a small boat in the Arctic and sailing away. But that's a story for another night. Tonight, we care about what his employers, the Dutch West India Company, decided to do next, which was plant a colony, right on the southern tip of an island that Lenape called Mannahatta, the island of many hills. The Dutch would flatten those hills later, because Europeans had a very firm land should be emotionally and physically flat philosophy. The company named the settlement New Amsterdam, because if you can't be original, at least be consistent. Imagine the island then. No skyscrapers, no Broadway, no overpriced coffee, just forests, streams, marshes, deer wandering around, and long beaches on both rivers. Everything smelled like pine and soil instead of hot garbage and street pretzels. It was, in one word, peaceful, which meant the Dutch would eventually fix that. Our first proper character in this dreamy stroll is Peter Minuit, the man involved in what might be the most overquoted real estate deal in American history. Was it actually $24 worth of trinkets? Probably not. Was it actually a purchase in the European sense? Absolutely not. But the Dutch certainly wrote it down as if the Lenape had enthusiastically signed a contract drafted by a 17th century corporate lawyer. Minuit himself was a calm-looking administrator with a kind of middle management energy. You know the vibe. The kind of man who would copy documents because he enjoys the structure. He served as director of New Netherland from 1626 to 1631 and tried, in his own overly organized way, to keep the settlement functioning. At this point, New Amsterdam was barely a village, more like a business trailer park with cows. A few dozen houses, a scattering of farms, and one wooden fort that the Dutch optimistically called Fort Amsterdam. It looked like something a group of teenagers might build if they found enough logs. Life in the colony was slow and muddy. People argued constantly. The Dutch West India Company micromanaged everything, and then complained when nothing ran smoothly. In other words, a classic startup environment. The indigenous Lenape communities tolerated the Dutch at first. They traded furs, they navigated around the strange European habits, but the Dutch kept expanding and enforcing rules that made sense only to them. You can imagine the Lenape elders watching them and thinking, these men cannot even build a roof properly. Why are they like this? But Minuit eventually left, pushed out after some company drama that mostly involved people not liking each other. It was a theme.
Let's drift ahead a few years to one of the most unintentionally comedic periods in early New York history, centered around a man who was, genuinely, tired of everyone. Enter Willem Kieft, a man whose leadership style could best be described as, what if a petty office manager became a governor? Kieft arrived in 1638 with a kind of self-important confidence that suggested he had never managed anything more complicated than a ledger. He took one look at the colony and immediately decided the local indigenous nations should pay taxes, which is bold and also guaranteed to cause trouble. He demanded tribute, wampum, corn, furs, from people who had been on the land for thousands of years. The Lenape and neighboring nations politely refused, in the way you refuse when someone tries to charge you rent for your own house. Kieft became increasingly frustrated, because nothing stresses out an incompetent administrator more than people not respecting his imaginary authority. Eventually, he started a conflict known as Kieft's War, which lasted from 1643 to 1645, and was exactly the kind of unnecessary disaster that happens when someone with no diplomacy skills tries to solve problems. The war weakened the colony, angered pretty much everyone, and left Kieft deeply unpopular. There's something quietly ironic about a man so determined to prove he was in charge that he ended up proving the opposite. When the Dutch West India Company recalled him, Kieft boarded a ship back to Amsterdam. The ship sank because, of course it did. New Amsterdam sighed in collective relief. Now we float over to the man who replaced him, the one who would shape early New York more than anyone else, a man iconic enough that even high school textbooks remember him, though always with the same tired portrait that makes him look like he just smelled burnt cabbage. Yes, Peter Stuyvesant, the man, the myth, the walking symbol of please stop making things worse. Stuyvesant arrived in 1647 with a wooden leg, a huge sense of self-importance, and an intense love of rules. He lost his leg in the Caribbean during a military expedition and replaced it with a decorated wooden one, so at least he had a little flair. He ruled like a stern father figure who never asked for kids but wound up with a whole colony anyway. He wanted order, clean streets, organized markets, proper behavior. Unfortunately, the settlers of New Amsterdam were not exactly the let's organize our shoes by color type. They liked drinking, loudly. They built houses wherever they wanted. They ignored curfews. They were, in short, New Yorkers in training. Stuyvesant was constantly frustrated. He issued rules, people ignored him. He fined them. They ignored him again. It was a quiet, passive-aggressive Cold War between a man who wanted order and a town that wanted to go to the tavern. But Stuyvesant did improve some things. He enforced sanitation rules, he expanded defenses, he cleaned up the streets, though clean is a relative term in the 1600s. He also tried, somewhat desperately, to make New Amsterdam feel like a real city. Under his watch, the colony expanded northward up the island. More farms, more houses, more tangled property disputes, the kind of slow, inevitable growth that turns villages into towns. But Stuyvesant also brought his own brand of intolerance. He banned Quakers. He tried to block Jewish refugees from settling there, unsuccessfully, thankfully, because the Dutch West India Company reminded him that bigotry was bad for business. Stuyvesant backed down in the annoyed way of a man who knew he wasn't winning the argument. At night, you can imagine him pacing his house, wooden leg clunking, muttering about people refusing to follow his very reasonable rules. Let's drift peacefully into the mid-1600s as tensions simmer quietly under the surface. The English had been eyeing New Netherland for years. They had colonies to the north and south. The Dutch were in the middle. To the English, this was like seeing someone take the middle seat on an airplane row you thought you had reserved. It bothered them on a fundamental, spiritual level. So in 1664, the English sent ships. Stuyvesant blustered. The townspeople shrugged. No one wanted to fight for a company town that never treated them well. The English took the colony almost peacefully. New Amsterdam became New York, named after the Duke of York, a man who would later become king and also prove himself mildly incompetent, but that's a bedtime tale for another day. Stuyvesant was allowed to stay on the island. He retired to his farm, a huge estate that stretched across what is now the East Village. Imagine him tending his land, complaining quietly about how everything had gone wrong because people didn't listen to him. He lived there until 1772, surrounded by orchards, family, and presumably a lingering sense of disappointment. Now that the English are in control, the sleepy little town begins to take on a new shape. Still small, still muddy, still smelling faintly of livestock and unwashed sailors. But the English brought a slightly more structured colonial system, not better, just different. They expanded trade. They reorganized streets. They built more houses, warehouses, piers, and administrative buildings. Slowly, New York became a place that felt less like an afterthought and more like a real outpost. Still, life was pretty simple. Farms dotted the island, merchants traded furs and timber, children ran through muddy paths, women ran households that required endless manual labor. Enslaved Africans were forced to build and maintain much of the settlement, a fact often softened in history classes, but absolutely woven into the city's foundations. Life moved slowly, sometimes tediously, but the colony kept growing. Let's drift over to the late 1600s, when New York was beginning to feel like a place connected to the wider world, even if it still had more goats than people. Ships came from the Caribbean and Europe, markets expanded, taverns multiplied, because no matter the era, New Yorkers will always find somewhere to drink and complain about taxes. And yet, compared to the city it would become, early New York was quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, a village pretending it might someday be important, but still small enough that neighbors argued over who stole whose chicken. It's a charming contrast, really, the future world capital of finance and culture, once being a place where someone's biggest problem might be a cow blocking the road. But little by little, the population grew. New York became diverse. English, Dutch, French, African, Caribbean, and German. People spoke different languages, ate different foods, and practiced different religions. The city's famous multicultural identity began not with grand ideals, but with the simple colonial reality that no one group could dominate entirely. And somewhere in this slow swirl of people, disputes, Farms and small ambitions, the seeds of modern New York were quietly sprouting. Here we rest for now, letting the early city drift quietly through your imagination. Small wooden houses, soft candlelight, distant waves, and the low murmur of a town that doesn't yet know what it will become.
Welcome back. Let's settle into that soft, slow rhythm again. The one where time feels a little syrupy and your thoughts drift like a lazy tide. We're still in early New York, still moving without hurry, still following the gentle chaos of people who definitely thought they were more organized than they actually were. So let's float into the late 1600s and early 1700s, an era when New York was English, technically stable, and emotionally extremely not stable. Because if early New York had a personality, it would be, I am calm, I am collected, I will scream at a stranger about property lines at 6 a.m. Even after the English takeover in 1664, the city didn't immediately change its character. It was still muddy. It was still small. It still had that faint ambiance of a bunch of people politely pretending this colony wasn't built on mutual irritation. But the new English administration settled in with its typical let's act like everything is under control approach. Governors came and went, some left quiet footprints, others left dramatic, petty, slightly embarrassing ones. Let's start drifting toward one such figure, Governor Edmund Andros. Andros arrived in 1674 looking like the kind of man who would file paperwork just to feel alive. He enforced order with the enthusiasm of a man who took his job far too seriously. He tried to standardize weights and measures, which for colonists who didn't even agree on where roads should go, was a bit ambitious. People tolerated him, mostly because he wasn't as chaotic as his predecessors. But Andros also had that stiff English vibe that must have grated on New Yorkers, who had inherited a bit of Dutch don't-tell-me-what-to-do energy. He left in 1680, likely relieved to return to England, where complaining was an art form more aligned with his emotional skill set. Still, New York grew slowly under English rule. By the late 1600s, the colony was edging towards something like urban life, although urban here means a few more houses, a slightly less pointless fort, and a growing number of taverns where everyone pretended to be more sober than they were. But beneath the peaceful surface, tensions simmered. And nothing brings out those tensions quite like a deeply awkward, deeply unpopular ruling family. Cue the Stuarts, England's reigning dynasty at the time. They had everything: power, wealth, terrible haircuts, and somehow still managed to be jealous, defensive, and emotionally exhausted by their own existence. This is the dynasty that gave New York its name, after James, Duke of York, younger brother of King Charles II. And James, well, James was the kind of man who desperately wanted to be liked, but had the charisma of a damp matchstick. His reign would later collapse spectacularly, but while he was still Duke, he controlled New York. He never visited, of course. No royal in their right mind was going to cross the Atlantic Ocean just to stand in a muddy town full of disgruntled Dutch farmers. But he did send representatives, and those representatives carried his energy like a perfume, mildly insecure, easily annoyed, determined to create order while having no idea how. One such representative was Thomas Dongan, appointed governor in 1682. Dongan brought a slightly gentler hand to governance. He oversaw the colony's first elected assembly, which introduced some basic laws that New Yorkers immediately argued about. He also established the city's early administrative boundaries, which is basically the historical equivalent of drawing lines on a map and hoping future generations wouldn't hate you for it. Spoiler, they did. But Dongan wasn't the dramatic one in this era. That honor goes to Jacob Leisler, a man who turned colonial insecurity into a full-blown political soap opera. Let's softly drift into Leisler's rebellion, a conflict that was somehow both very boring and very dramatic, which is exactly the energy we want for bedtime. It began in 1689, during the Glorious Revolution back in England, when James II, remember our damp matchstick Duke of York, was overthrown. Colonies panicked because when your king gets yeeted off the throne, there's a sense things might get messy. In New York, a group of militiamen seized control of the colony, and at the center was Jacob Leisler, a German-born merchant who probably woke up that day thinking, you know what, I should be in charge. He declared himself the acting governor. Half the colony supported him, half despised him. It was, in classic New York fashion, an event defined by loud opinions and extremely low patience. Leisler ruled for about 2 years, anxiously, stubbornly, and with a level of paranoia that suggests he did not sleep much. When the new English governor finally arrived, Leisler refused to step down. The standoff ended with Leisler being arrested and executed, which is grim, but also weirdly predictable when you stage a rebellion and then act surprised when the government dislikes that.
The rebellion split New York's political elite for decades afterward. Even in the 1700s, you could make people at dinner parties uncomfortable just by saying Leisler, which honestly is kind of impressive. Now let's gently glide into the early 1700s, when New York was beginning to feel more like a city. Growing population, steady trade, and just enough dysfunction to be charming. The population reached around 5,000 people. Streets slowly filled in, shops and markets expanded, and enslaved labor continued to build the colony's economy. A quiet, harsh reality woven into every brick and beam. Africans made up roughly 15 to 20% of the population by the 1730s. Many worked in households. Others labored on docks, farms, or building projects. Their existence kept the colony running, even as laws restricted nearly every aspect of their lives. It's one of the many contradictions of early New York, a city that would one day become synonymous with freedom, built partially through forced labor. But the daily life of the city still had an almost village-like atmosphere. There were street vendors selling bread, fish, and vegetables. There were chickens wandering freely because no one had invented meaningful animal control. There were disputes over fences and property boundaries. And there was a growing sense that New York was developing a personality, blunt, diverse, slightly irritable, and deeply practical. Even then, people described New Yorkers as direct, stubborn, and oddly attached to arguing, as if the island itself gave everyone a mild case of, "You're not the boss of me." Let's drift toward another sleepy figure from this era, Benjamin Fletcher, governor from 1692 to 1698. Fletcher had the energy of a man who really enjoyed expensive clothes and minimal responsibility. His administration was known for, let's say, flexible ethics. He granted so many questionable licenses to privateers, pirates, but make it legal-ish, that New York briefly became a hub for wealthy captains who brought in suspicious amounts of gold. Everyone knew. Everyone shrugged. It was New York. If it made money, people pretended not to see the moral implications. Eventually, Fletcher's pirate side hustle annoyed the English government enough that he was removed from office. But he left behind a faintly glamorous, faintly ridiculous legacy of the governor who basically said yes to anyone with a ship and a questionable moral compass. Then comes Lord Cornbury, governor from 1702 to 1708. If early New York had a least emotionally stable authority figure, Cornbury would win it. Cornbury was a cousin of Queen Anne and famously eccentric. Some stories claim he liked to dress in women's clothing. Others say it was just scandalous gossip. Either way, he was an undeniably odd man with a tendency to irritate everyone. He mismanaged funds, he imposed strange decisions, he feuded with local leaders, and he spent so much time annoying people that he was eventually recalled to England where someone else could deal with his chaotic energy. Imagine him wandering the streets of early New York in full wig and finery, trailed by confused colonists, wondering if this was really the best person the English could send. Spoiler, it was not. As we drift further into the 1700s, New York slowly expands into a port city of growing importance. Ships fill the harbor, cargo vessels from the Caribbean carrying sugar, molasses, and rum. Ships from London filled with textiles, tools, and manufactured goods, and smaller coastal vessels carrying timber, wheat, and livestock. Merchants grow wealthier, taverns multiply like rabbits, and local politics remain a low simmer of grudges, gossip, and occasionally someone throwing a document dramatically onto a table. By the 1730s, New York is home to about 10,000 people. Still small, still manageable, still full of dirt roads and wooden houses, but definitely awake. Still, it's not a city of harmony. Every group, English, Dutch, German, African, Jewish Huguenot, brings its own traditions, languages, and grudges. It wasn't a melting pot yet, more like a polite standoff between pots that occasionally borrowed sugar from each other. But diversity gave New York a cultural richness uncommon in other English colonies. You could hear Dutch spoken on one street, English on the next, Yiddish a little further along, and various African languages woven into the soundscape of the docks. A city that talked, constantly, loudly, persistently. Now let's float gently into one of the stranger, quieter chapters of early New York, the slave conspiracy panic of 1741. This was not a dramatic moment, no battles, no grand speeches, just a simmering fear that boiled over into deep injustice. After a series of unexplained fires broke out in the city, local authorities jumped to the conclusion that enslaved Africans were plotting rebellion. Their reasoning was thin, the evidence thinner, but fear is a persuasive storyteller. Trials were held, confessions were coerced, executions took place. And when the panic finally subsided, most people quietly agreed the whole ordeal had spiraled far beyond reason. It was the kind of event that revealed the colony's underlying anxieties, fears of revolt, fears of instability, fears of losing control. And it exposed how fragile the city still was, even as it grew wealthier and more interconnected. This wasn't the New York of bold ideals and sharp skyscrapers. This was a New York still learning what kind of society it wanted to be, and often failing. But daily life went on. Merchants expanded their businesses, shipbuilders hammered away on the waterfront, farmers brought produce into town for small markets, and children played near the docks. And the city, that future titan, kept growing in quiet, uneven steps. By mid-century, theaters appeared, libraries opened, coffee houses hosted debates that mostly devolved into arguments about taxes or trade policies. The city was becoming more literate, more connected, more aware of the world. And yet, it remained calm in its own disorganized way, a place where nothing happened quickly, even when people wanted it to. Let's drift toward one last figure for this part, someone who'd shaped the next chapter of the city's story, James Delancey, lieutenant governor for much of the 1750s. Delancey was locally born, wealthy, and charming in the way that made people trust him even when they knew they shouldn't. He oversaw New York during years of growth, new streets, expanding trade, and rising political tension. Delancey represents a shift, the moment when New York's elite began imagining themselves not just as colonists, but as something more, as New Yorkers, a people with their own identity, their own priorities, and their own increasingly complicated relationship with the British Crown. The stage was quietly being set for the next era, one where the city would get louder, richer, more political, and much harder to fall asleep to. But for now, we stay in the calm before the storm. A small city of wooden houses, muddy lanes, flickering lanterns, and a gentle hum of trade drifting across the harbor. New York was still young, still soft edges, still figuring out what it wanted to be. And that's where we'll pause for tonight.
Welcome back. Settle in again. Let your shoulders loosen just a little. We're drifting into the mid-1700s now. That strange, quiet era where New York was beginning to stretch its limbs, still half asleep, still not fully aware that it was about to stumble into one of the most dramatic centuries imaginable. But don't worry, we're not doing drama here. Just soft, steady storytelling, slow enough that your brain can wander without missing anything important. So let's float gently into pre-revolutionary New York, a place full of polite tension, mild irritations, and an endless supply of people who thought they were very important, but were usually just tired. By the 1750s, New York had grown into a moderately busy port city. Not bustling, not impressive, but definitely awake enough to complain about taxes. The harbor was always dotted with ships, small sloops, larger merchant vessels, sometimes even a naval ship that parked beside the docks like an overly dramatic chaperone. Goods came and went constantly. Lumber, grain, furs, rum, molasses, cloth, and occasionally items so mysterious no one wanted to ask where they came from. The streets were still mostly muddy, though if you squinted, you could pretend they were improving. Houses pressed closer together. Shop fronts multiplied. There were coffee houses where people debated politics far more confidently than they should have. And there were taverns, always taverns, full of sailors, apprentices, and merchants, loudly insisting they were not as drunk as they seemed. It was a city full of energy, but also full of contradictions. New Yorkers loved freedom, but the city still allowed slavery. New Yorkers loved trade, but taxes made them furious. New Yorkers loved arguing. Well, that part hasn't changed. But in the soft light of candlelit evenings and quiet mornings, the city felt more like a calm tide pool than a stormy harbor. For now, at least. One of the most quietly influential figures of this era was James Delancey, whom we met earlier. Let's drift a little deeper into his world. Delancey was part of one of New York's wealthiest families, the kind of old money dynasty that walked into a room and expected everyone else to adjust their chairs. He was polished, educated, and absolutely certain that the Delanceys knew best about everything. He served as Chief Justice, then as Lieutenant Governor, and sometimes even as acting governor when England couldn't be bothered to send someone new. New Yorkers tolerated him partly because he was competent and partly because he was local. He understood the city's rhythms, the arguments, the grudges, the tendency of merchants to think they were smarter than officials. Under Delancey, the city got its first real newspaper culture. And by culture, I mean newspapermen printing mildly insulting editorials about each other, then pretending they were doing something noble. But this period also birthed one of the most quietly iconic legal cases in early America, the trial of John Peter Zenger in 1735. Zenger, a printer, published criticisms of the colonial government, polite by modern standards, but scandalous to a governor who preferred absolute control. He was arrested for libel. His trial became a debate about freedom of the press, and Zenger was acquitted. The case didn't spark immediate change, but it quietly planted a seed in the minds of colonists. Maybe we should be allowed to criticize people in fancy wigs. It was one of those subtle tipping points in history. Not loud, not chaotic, just a small shift that would echo decades later. Meanwhile, the city's population kept growing. By the 1760s, it stood at around 18,000 people. That's roughly the size of a modern suburban town, but at the time it felt enormous. The city sprawled northward from the old Dutch center. Street grids began to make an appearance. Not the clean grid the city would later adopt, but a kind of trial and error grid designed by people who clearly struggled with straight lines. The wealthy families, the Livingstons, the Morrises, the Delanceys, built large townhouses. Merchants set up counting houses near the docks. Ordinary workers lived in cramped wooden houses where privacy was a myth and ventilation was a distant dream. Enslaved Africans lived in even harsher conditions. Small quarters, strict controls, constant surveillance. Yet they formed communities, traditions, and a cultural life beneath the city's surface that history books too often reduce to a footnote. New York was growing, but not evenly. It was prosperous, but not for everyone. It was diverse, but tensions simmered beneath the surface, quiet as a heartbeat. Let's float now toward the French and Indian War, which began in 1554. Don't worry, we're not doing battles or violence. We're staying in the background, where New York quietly experienced everything secondhand. The war itself was mostly fought far from the city, but it had an impact. British troops passed through. Merchants made money supplying the military. Taxes rose. British authority tightened. And something subtle shifted in the minds of New Yorkers. Before this era, most colonists still thought of themselves as English subjects. Tired subjects, annoyed subjects, but still loyal subjects. After the war, people began questioning things. Why did the British government treat them like unruly children? Why did London officials ignorant about colonial life? Why were taxes increasing when the war was supposedly over? It was the slow beginning of a very long, very sleepy political awakening. Think of it as New York stretching after a long nap and realizing the bed is uncomfortable. The British didn't help matters by imposing the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on paper goods. New Yorkers, who loved paperwork almost as much as they loved complaining, were outraged. Lawyers protested. Merchants protested. Newspapers mocked the government with barely disguised sarcasm. Even ordinary workers grumbled. The Stamp Act was repealed the next year, but the damage was done. New York had discovered that it actually enjoyed resisting the British more than obeying them. The Sons of Liberty emerged from this period, not yet dramatic revolutionaries, but more like a group of deeply irritated neighbors who held very loud meetings. Their gatherings were probably more exhausting than exciting, full of speeches, debates, and men who loved the sound of their own voices. But political identity was forming, slowly and steadily, like mist rolling in. New York wasn't ready to rebel. Not yet, but it was definitely preparing its list of complaints for when the time came.
Let's soften our focus and drift into daily life again. Imagine early New York in the evening. Narrow streets lit by lanterns, the smell of the harbor drifting on the wind. Not good, not terrible, just existing. Horses clopping along cobblestones, voices drifting from taverns, merchants closing shutters for the night, children chasing each other past doorways, the quiet murmur of a city settling into sleep. And above it all, a sense that things were changing. The wealthy hosted dinners with imported wine and polite gossip. Artisans worked by candlelight. Enslaved workers quietly completed their tasks before returning to cramped quarters. Sailors wandered drunkenly through the streets. And the city breathed, slow, steady, unaware of how famous it would one day become. Now, let's glide gently into one of the most ironically sleepy political incidents in New York's pre-revolution era, the Battle of Golden Hill in 1770. Calling it a battle is generous. It was more like a dysfunctional family argument, but with uniforms. British soldiers clashed with local residents over the removal of liberty poles, wooden symbols erected by the Sons of Liberty. The soldiers kept cutting them down, the colonists kept putting them back up. It was a passive-aggressive cycle that lasted for years. Finally, tensions boiled over in a small street confrontation. A few people were injured, no one wrote poetry about it, but New Yorkers would later insist it was very important, mostly because Boston had the Boston Massacre and New York felt left out. It's a perfect example of New York's early political energy, not heroic, not organized, just stubborn and theatrical in a very human way. By the early 1770s, New York was fully in its grumpy teenage phase, still technically under British control, but definitely tired of being told what to do. The Tea Act of 1773 arrived. Boston responded with the Boston Tea Party, dramatic, bold, downright cinematic. New York considered doing something similar, but New Yorkers, being New Yorkers, wanted to argue about the plan for several weeks first. Meetings were held, committees were formed, voices were raised. Nothing happened. It was democracy in its most "we want change, but also snacks" form. Eventually, ships carrying taxed tea arrived. New Yorkers stalled, pressured, negotiated, and eventually forced the tea to be returned to England, not by dumping it into the harbor, but by paperwork and passive aggression. Classic New York. As the political climate heated up, New York found itself torn between loyalty and rebellion. It was a city of merchants, after all. Trade with Britain meant profit. Revolution meant risk. Families were split. Some supported independence, others remained loyal, and the rest tried to avoid picking a side because they valued a quiet life. But the tide of revolution was rising, slowly but steadily. When the Continental Congress met in 1774, New York sent delegates, reluctantly, cautiously, as if they were attending a family reunion they couldn't escape. After the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775, the revolutionary movement gained momentum. New York became a gathering point for Continental troops. But unlike Boston or Philadelphia, New York wasn't ready to declare independence with fireworks.
New Yorkers preferred to sigh heavily and think things through for an unreasonably long time. Still, the shift was happening. You could feel it in the harbor winds, in the way people spoke, in the number of British troops arriving quietly in the city. The peaceful, sleepy days were ending. A new era was drifting in, not loud, not yet, but inevitable. Let's pause here with New York in 1775, a city balancing on the edge of revolution, still quiet, still uncertain, still trying to keep its shoes clean in muddy streets. The next part will take us into New York's role in the revolution itself, still told gently, still without battles, still as a calm narrative drifting through a chaotic time.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you're settling deeper into your pillow, perfect. If your blanket is forming that warm little cocoon around your shoulders, even better. Because this next stretch of New York's early life is a slow, gentle slide from Dutch chaos into English chaos. And yes, because this is early American urban history, everyone kept fighting over land they didn't fully understand, claiming rivers they couldn't spell, and renaming things for kings who absolutely never visited the place. So let's drift into the last decades of Dutch rule, and the moment when the English showed up, with the energy of a neighbor who keeps borrowing your tools and then quietly moves into your shed. Let's float back into it. So by the 1650s, New Amsterdam had a vibe. Not exactly a flattering one, but definitely a vibe. You could call it scrappily functional, or barely holding itself together by the power of stubborn Dutch bookkeeping. Either works. Streets were still mud, chickens continued to treat those streets like a personal promenade, every third person had an ongoing legal dispute about something trivial like a neighbor's goat looking at him the wrong way. Basically, early New York behaved exactly like modern New York, just with fewer taxis and more thatched roofs. And at the center of all this was Peter Stuyvesant, trying in vain to control a town that had never once listened to anybody, not even themselves. Stuyvesant's New Amsterdam, a town where rules existed, sort of, but mostly as light suggestions. Stuyvesant tried reforms. He passed ordinances. He enforced curfews. He tried to stop people from firing guns inside taverns, because apparently that was a thing. But the people, they just shrugged and went, and then kept doing whatever they wanted. One of Stuyvesant's biggest frustrations was the constant smuggling. The Dutch West India Company said, "Only trade with us." But New Yorkers, even in the 1600s, acted like that kid who cannot resist lifting snacks from someone else's lunchbox. English ships, French ships, pirate ships. If it docked, New Amsterdam traded with it. You could practically hear Stuyvesant wheezing in bureaucratic distress. He would stomp around with his peg leg clacking against the floorboards, muttering about illegal imports, while merchants quietly rolled barrels of forbidden goods out the back door. It was all very on brand for early Manhattan. Meanwhile, the English were watching. And they were doing that English thing of pretending not to want something while absolutely wanting it. The English had colonies to the north, New England, and to the south, Virginia and Maryland, and right between them, this odd little Dutch trading post, like a single puzzle piece from the wrong box. And the English, being the English, eventually decided that this piece should obviously belong to them, because why not consolidate an entire coastline? But before they marched in, they liked to poke at New Amsterdam. Little rumors, little provocations, little accidental fishing expeditions in Dutch waters. If New Amsterdam were a person, the English were that coworker who keeps inching closer to your lunch in the break room, going, "Oh, were you going to eat that?" Now, one of the biggest sparks in this whole tension was not political at all.
It was household maintenance, specifically fences. In the 1600s, borders were not crisp lines on a map. They were vague, they were confusing, they were interpreted like an improv performance, with everyone insisting their version was correct. So the English farmers in Connecticut and Long Island kept letting their cows wander into Dutch land. The Dutch farmers then angrily pushed the cows back. The English pushed them forward again. The cows, meanwhile, minded their own business and chewed grass with zero geopolitical awareness. Stuyvesant, in absolute agony, kept sending letters requesting the English stop trespassing. The English governors politely ignored him. It was all very passive-aggressive and very pastoral. And then there were the Swedes. Because yes, the Swedes suddenly enter the story. A tiny Swedish colony had popped up in the Delaware region, like a small Scandinavian surprise party. The Dutch were annoyed, the English were also annoyed, basically everyone was annoyed. The Swedish colony was like that unexpected extra person in a group photo who just materializes behind the main cast. They were friendly enough, but nobody knew what to do with the new Swedish inhabitants. Stuyvesant naturally decided to deal with them. And by deal, he meant sail down there, yell for a bit, and then annex the place. So he added New Sweden to the Dutch territories, which made New Amsterdam look a little more impressive on paper, even if nobody really knew what to do with the new Swedish inhabitants.
But while Stuyvesant was out conquering tiny Swedish forts, New Amsterdam itself was on the verge of something, well, not great. Money was tight, the fort was falling apart, the company refused to invest, the English colonies kept expanding, and the locals were increasingly tired of Stuyvesant's grumpy uncle management style. In 1653, New Amsterdam asked for something new, a city council. Why? Because the townspeople were done with Stuyvesant shouting at everyone like an irritated father figure. So they formed a group of burgomasters and schepens, basically Dutch mayors and magistrates. Stuyvesant hated it. He tried to keep all the real power for himself. He showed up to meetings uninvited, he vetoed everything. It was like watching someone refuse to hand over the TV remote, even after everyone agreed on a movie. But the council stayed, and slowly, painfully, New Amsterdam began transforming from a corporate trading outpost into an actual little city. And at the same time, Manhattan's population was changing fast. More immigrants arrived: Germans, French Huguenots, Portuguese Jews, Scots, free black families, sailors from everywhere. Basically, New Amsterdam was becoming New York long before the name changed. It was messy, noisy, crowded, unregulated, and absolutely impossible to manage. In other words, the city was finally hitting its stride. And while the population ballooned, the need for space grew. Suddenly, people began looking north of the little town center. Fields were cleared, roads were extended, timber houses popped up like mushrooms after rain. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't planned. It was New York doing what New York always does, expanding, because it felt like it. Let's drift to a particularly amusing moment in all this chaos. The city decided it wanted street lights, which sounds very civilized until you hear the details. Every household was ordered to hang a lantern outside at night, and the lanterns were to be lit from dusk until 9, which would have been lovely if anyone actually did it. Mostly the lanterns hung there, unlit, swaying sadly in the breeze, making the street look like it was decorated for a festival that no one bothered to attend. The city also introduced a night watch, except the watchmen were usually drunk, asleep, or just wandering around chatting, which made them, honestly, not particularly different from modern security guards in big-box stores. Still, these were the first tiny steps toward making New Amsterdam feel like an actual European-style city, even if it barely worked. Meanwhile, the English pressure intensified. They weren't subtle about it anymore. Oliver Cromwell once considered invading the colony outright. Then Charles II came to power and thought, interesting, a Dutch city right in the middle of my coastline. That seems inconvenient. So he gave his brother, the Duke of York, a charming little gift: all the Dutch territories on the North American coast. Which was bold, considering England did not own them. But English kings have always loved giving away things that do not belong to them, so this was very on brand. The Duke of York accepted happily. He probably had no idea where New Amsterdam even was, but the title sounded fancy, so he nodded. And just like that, without firing a shot yet, the English decided New Amsterdam was theirs. Of course, the locals had no clue. They were too busy arguing about oyster rights and whose pigs were wandering into whose potato patches. Life went on with its usual small dramas. Merchants continued avoiding taxes. Taverns continued serving drinks that were probably 80% alcohol, 20% mystery. And Stuyvesant continued lecturing anyone within earshot. But change was coming. And it arrived, ironically enough, by sea. In 1664, 4 English warships appeared in the harbor. They sailed in calmly, almost politely, and anchored near the fort. The people of New Amsterdam stared at them. The English soldiers waved. It was all very civil. Stuyvesant panicked internally while maintaining a stern exterior. He hobbled around the fort, barking orders that everyone ignored. The fort's cannons were rusty, the walls were splitting, the powder was damp. In short, the city was not exactly battle-ready. The English commander sent a letter: "Surrender peacefully, or we will take the city by force." The city council begged Stuyvesant to surrender. The merchants begged him. Even his own soldiers begged him. No one wanted a pointless fight. Stuyvesant, in classic Stuyvesant fashion, tried to rally resistance. He even tore up the surrender demand dramatically. But the townspeople taped it back together and read it anyway. And finally, reluctantly, Stuyvesant gave in. A few days later, the Dutch flag came down, the English one went up, and New Amsterdam quietly became New York, named after the Duke of York, who, again, had never set foot anywhere near this place. Stuyvesant retreated to his farm, the English took administrative control, and the people went back to their daily business, barely affected. Because the thing about early New York is it never really cared who owned it. It just wanted to trade.
And strangely enough, the transition was peaceful. The English didn't want to disrupt commerce. The Dutch residents kept their property. Religious freedom stayed intact. The courts continued operating basically the same way. The English swapped out a few officials, changed the signage, and carried on. It was like a corporate rebrand. Same building, new logo, same dysfunction underneath. The borders expanded, the new government encouraged settlement, and slowly the city grew from a small Dutch experiment into a cornerstone of England's Atlantic Empire. But beneath the New English surface, the city remained deeply multicultural, deeply chaotic, and deeply committed to doing things its own way. In other words, it remained New York. And the story's just starting to get interesting in that slow, sleepy, historical way.
Hey guys, welcome back. If you've made it to part 5, you're probably deep in that cozy half-dream state where the outside world is turning into a soft hum. Perfect. That's exactly the mood we need tonight, because English New York unfolds slowly, like a loaf of bread rising. But someone forgot to set a timer, and now we're all just sitting around watching the dough expand at its own lazy pace. So take a breath, sink a little further into whatever you're resting on, and let's drift deeper into the first century of English New York, a period defined by mild confusion, moderate corruption,
and the city's ongoing commitment to ignoring every rule the crown tried to impose. Because if Dutch New Amsterdam was stubbornly independent, English New York took that energy and simply added more lawyers. Let's float in. So, New York is English now. Kinda. Mostly. On paper, at least. When the English took control in 1664, they expected the city to suddenly turn into a model English colony. You know, neatly governed, thoroughly Anglican, obedient to royal authority. But what they actually got was New York. Still Dutch, still multilingual, still running half its economy under the table, still arguing about oyster beds, wandering goats, and property lines that made no geometric sense. The English governors arrived, took one long look around, and quietly realized they had inherited a city that behaved less like a colony and more like a teenager who refuses to clean their room. And honestly, they just rolled with it. First up was Colonel Richard Nicolls, our inaugural English governor, the man who accepted the surrender, the man who renamed the place for the Duke of York. He stepped into office expecting resistance and instead got shrugged acceptance from locals who just wanted trade to continue. For Nicolls, this was almost disappointing. He'd brought warships. He was mentally prepared for drama. He got paperwork. So Nicolls settled into a sleepy routine. Adjust boundaries here, confirm land grants there, referee Dutch-English property squabbles, listen to complaints about cows, pigs, and fences. The man's greatest enemy during his tenure was probably boredom. He did, however, implement one important thing: the Duke's Laws, a whole set of regulations intended to standardize life across the region. They introduced rules about taverns, rules about property, rules about marriage, rules about moral behavior that no one followed for even a day. One ordinance said people couldn't drink on Sundays. New Yorkers immediately ignored it, because some traditions start early. Nicolls pretended not to notice. After Nicolls came Francis Lovelace. Not related to Ada Lovelace, no computers here. Just a mildly tired English administrator trying to keep locals from setting things on fire. Lovelace was very into public improvement projects. He pushed for better roads, a postal service, a ferry between Manhattan and Brooklyn, and maybe hopefully less chaos. The ferry idea actually stuck. A man named John Sharp was granted the first franchise to operate it. Imagine that, the very first authorized ferry to Brooklyn, centuries before hipsters, overpriced brunch, or artisanal pickles. Just a small boat, a river, and probably a handful of passengers clutching chickens. Lovelace was proud. He felt like he was building something lasting. Of course, the moment he finally got the colony somewhat organized, the Dutch showed up again. Yes, the Dutch came back. Briefly, awkwardly, like an ex trying to reclaim their favorite hoodie. In 1673, during one of those periodic European wars that everyone in Europe kept starting out of sheer boredom, a Dutch fleet appeared off Manhattan. New York was lightly defended, Lovelace was out of town, the fort was still in its charmingly dilapidated phase. The Dutch basically walked in and said, "We'll take that back, thanks." And New York became New Orange for about 15 months. It was a very short-lived reunion, like a TV reboot that nobody asked for. The Dutch reinstated some old customs. They reintroduced Dutch officials. Everyone dusted off their old legal records. People grumbled but went along with it because, honestly, New Yorkers are adaptable. But then, in 1674, the war ended. Peace was signed, and the Dutch quietly handed the city back to England.
The whole episode felt like the colonial version of "you can borrow it, no wait, I need it, actually never mind." When the English took over again, they sent a new governor. And oh boy, here comes Edmund Andros. Andros was strict, serious, very into enforcing royal authority, which, as you may guess, went over with New Yorkers about as well as someone suggesting a 9 p.m. curfew on a Friday. He tried regulating trade. New Yorkers smuggled anyway. He tried controlling the courts. The courts rolled their eyes. He tried maintaining order. Chaos giggled in the corner. To make things more fun, the region was still dealing with boundary disputes. Connecticut, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, everyone had thoughts about where their borders should be. Andros spent half his time drawing, redrawing, and angrily redrawing maps. He was basically a human eraser. But the true challenge was the economy. The Crown tried to run New York like a revenue machine. The merchants wanted to run New York like a semi-legal free trade festival. Guess who won? Yes, the merchants. They always do.
The colony also continued to become even more diverse. By the late 1600s, Manhattan had become a gentle swirl of Dutch farmers, English soldiers, French Huguenots, German artisans, Scottish traders, Irish laborers, a growing African population, both enslaved and free, native communities navigating an increasingly stressful relationship with colonists, and a constant flow of sailors who drifted in and out like tidewater. On some days, the city probably felt like a medieval airport. Multiple languages blended in the streets. Multiple religions existed side by side. Multiple legal customs overlapped in a tangled mess. If you've ever wondered why New York grew up with a personality that is simultaneously welcoming, impatient, opinionated, and allergic to conformity, this is where it begins. By the late 1600s, the city started looking more like a proper English port. Custom houses were built, warehouses lined the waterfront, merchants expanded their docks. The Crown imposed more taxes. Merchants spent more time inventing new ways to avoid them. Carts and barrels filled narrow lanes that were now too crowded for horses to pass comfortably. New York's traffic problem was born early and never stopped screaming. Little by little, the city crept north. Fields became streets. Lanes became neighborhoods. Houses got taller. The skyline remained low, but compared to the huts of 1626, it felt very metropolitan. There was even talk of creating formal marketplaces, which required people to agree on things, something New Yorkers were famously bad at. Still, progress marched on. And then we drift into something slow and simmering, a political tension. You could call it the city's first midlife crisis. By the late 1680s, James, Duke of York, the guy New York is named after, became King James II. This means the entire colony now technically belonged to the king himself, which made New York a royal pet project. James wanted order, centralization, uniformity, very English values. New York wanted freedom, flexible trade, local autonomy, very New York values. It was bound to get messy. James II decided to merge several colonies, including New York, into something called the Dominion of New England, a big administrative chunk run by a single governor. And who did he choose to run this giant new entity? Edmund Andros. Yes, him again. New Yorkers sighed deeply. Andros returned with sweeping authority. He reorganized courts. He suspended local assemblies. He introduced royal taxes. He insisted on Anglican conformity. The colony tolerated him barely,
but you could sense the slow boil. And then the world shifted. In 1688, the Glorious Revolution happened in England. James II was overthrown. William and Mary replaced him. A very peaceful, very polite English coup. The news traveled across the ocean slowly. When it reached New York, the reaction was dramatic in the most sluggish colonial way. No one knew who was in charge. Royal officials panicked. Merchants whispered. The garrison muttered. Rumors drifted through coffee houses like sleepy smoke. And into this confusion stepped Jacob Leisler, a German merchant with confidence levels far exceeding his actual power base. Leisler led a local militia faction and seized control of the city government. Not violently, just very forcefully and very awkwardly. He claimed he was holding New York for the new monarchs, William and Mary. And technically he was. He just didn't have permission. Leisler governed for about a year and a half. He made mild reforms. He made enemies. Lots of enemies. Basically, everyone except his immediate supporters disliked him. When the crown finally sent an official governor, Leisler hesitated to surrender. This was not wise. He was arrested, tried, executed. It was messy. Emotionally messy. Politically messy. And thoroughly unnecessary. New Yorkers filed it away in their collective memory as just another day in the colony. The city went back to its routine the next week. Because New York moves on. Always. With that, the colony finally settled into a new era, one under firm royal control. But even so, the city kept growing with that slow, inevitable push. More houses, more shops, more languages, more alleyways clogged with carts, more taverns that never followed regulations. Slowly, steadily, calmly, New York began drifting toward its destiny as a major Atlantic port. And all of this, all of it, happened decades before the Revolution, decades before Wall Street, decades before skyscrapers. Just a sleepy little colony turning into something bigger, one quiet, stubborn step at a time.
The room around you grows even quieter now, as if the world itself is shifting into a gentler rhythm. Your body feels heavy, but in the most peaceful way, like you're floating just above the surface of a calm lake while the night sky stretches endlessly overhead. You drift deeper. Every sound becomes softer. Every thought becomes slower. Every breath becomes smoother. It's the next phase, a place where the mind no longer tries to stay awake, yet it's still aware enough to enjoy the calm. You feel that warm, comforting wave again, starting at your feet, moving slowly upward, reminding your body that it is safe to release, to loosen, to let go. The deeper you drift, the more distant the world becomes, as though history itself is drifting with you, like pages turning one by one in a massive old library. Somewhere in that quiet space, the soft echo of America in 1776 continues, but now it plays like a slow, gentle lullaby. You see dim lanterns glowing on wooden porches, a horse walking lazily along a dirt road, a peaceful village settling into the night. The air is cool, the world is silent, and you are drifting deeper still.
Your breathing matches the rhythm of that old world, steady, slow, effortless. In this phase, your body knows exactly what to do. It welcomes the heaviness, lets the muscles loosen, allows the mind to float. You're no longer listening actively, you're simply absorbing, as if the story is flowing around you like warm water, carrying you gently towards sleep. The deeper you drift, the softer everything becomes, until all that remains is calm, stillness, and the slow fading of the day. And now, you're ready for the next part, the place where dreaming begins to take shape, quietly, naturally, all on its own.
As you drift further, the boundary between waking and dreaming becomes softer, blurred, almost non-existent. Your thoughts no longer form full sentences. They melt into shapes, into colors, into gentle impressions that come and go like waves. You're descending, slowly, effortlessly, into the dream layer. Your breathing is calm. Your chest rises and falls as if guided by something ancient and automatic, a rhythm older than memory itself. The world of 1776 drifts with you, but now it feels lighter, like a faint picture moving in the background of your mind. You see the glow of small lanterns hanging outside wooden cabins. You hear the distant murmur of a quiet river. Everything is slow, peaceful, untouched. The villagers sleep. The night is thick and comfortable. And you drift deeper into that same peaceful stillness. With every breath, your muscles loosen even more. Your shoulders soften. Your arms feel weightless. Your legs sink deeper into the surface beneath you. Your mind begins to float. Thoughts come gently, like soft feathers falling, and then dissolve before they land. You are no longer trying to sleep. You are simply allowing yourself to drift wherever your body wants to go. Far in the distance, a warm golden haze forms, the earliest hint of the dream world waiting to welcome you in. It doesn't rush, it doesn't pull, it simply opens, inviting you, quietly, naturally, to step inside. You're right on the edge now, that beautifully delicate place where the body rests and the mind begins to paint its own world. You feel safe, you feel calm, you feel heavy in all the right ways. And as you drift deeper into this dream layer, you realize there's no need to do anything. Sleep is already forming around you like a soft blanket of quiet. You're drifting now, not falling, not sinking, just gliding into softer and softer darkness. The world around you feels muted, as if someone has slowly turned the volume down on everything except your breathing and your heartbeat, steady, calm, rhythmic. Your eyelids grow heavier, not forced, not tired, simply ready. Ready to let go, ready to drift. The edge of sleep is no longer a line. It is a warm, open space stretching out in front of you. You step into it without effort, almost without noticing, because you've already been drifting there for some time. Your thoughts fade into gentle shapes now. Not words, not ideas, just soft impressions that float like mist. A lantern glows far off in the distance, the same lantern from the old American village you were exploring. But now it flickers slowly, dimly, as if preparing to disappear into the dream world. You hear the quiet hum of nighttime insects, blending into the calm rhythm of water, moving somewhere far away. And even these sounds grow softer, slower, blurred into something comforting. Your body feels perfectly still, as if it finally understands that it's allowed to rest deeply, completely, fully. And as the last bits of tension fade, your mind begins to tip over the edge. This is the moment just before dreaming begins. A gentle weightlessness fills your thoughts. Your breathing becomes so soft you hardly notice it. And then there is nothing to hold on to, nothing you need to manage, nothing you need to think. Only peace, only quiet, only the slow drift into deep, natural sleep. Let yourself float. Let your body sink. Let your mind wander into its own soft world.
Just let everything loosen now. No direction, no path, just a gentle glide into the softest place your mind knows. You're already halfway dreaming. All we're doing now is opening the door the rest of the way. Your body feels warm and familiar, a quiet weight under the blankets. No effort, no pressure, just rest settling into every limb. Your thoughts drift like feathers, light, slow, unimportant. They float away long before you can shape them. You notice this, and then even that noticing fades into the background. Ahead of you, a soft glow forms, not bright, not sharp, just the vague, dreamy kind of light your mind creates when it's ready to let go. You're walking toward it without moving, gliding, barely touching the ground, as if gravity itself has decided to take the night off. There's no story now, no history, no timeline, just the gentle landscape your brain draws when it feels completely safe. A slow breeze hums across the scene, not cold, not warm, just perfectly neutral. The kind of temperature that lets your skin forget it even exists. The last strands of waking thought stretch thin, thin, until they dissolve. You feel the shift. It's tiny, like the quiet click of a door closing behind you. You're inside now, inside the dream. Inside the softest version of your own mind, floating, drifting, weightless. Nothing pulls at you, nothing calls for you. The world has fully stepped aside to give you this moment. And you sink deeper and deeper,
and deeper still, into a calm so wide and quiet it feels endless. Your thoughts fade, images bloom slowly, everything softens into warm, hazy color. This is the space where dreams begin to form, quietly, gently, without you needing to guide them. Just rest, just drift, just breathe. You have slipped fully and effortlessly into the dream itself. And now you stay there, untouched, floating in the deepest peace of the night.